Jesi milostiv i čovekoljubiv Bog, i tebi slavu uznosimo, Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, sada i u vekove vekova.
In a world of shadows and secrets untold, where primeval stories make the brave go cold, mighty gods on high and realms below, whispers of legends that shape each soul. And nightmarish dreams, cryptids lurking, nothing's as it seems, giants walking, angels and demons fight, only truth can bring the light. Through the echoes of time, the tales unfold, mysteries arise as the prophecies are foretold. From valiant knights to buried treasure, this podcast brings nothing but pleasure. Welcome to myth, mysteries and majesty. Study with us and don't be a travesty. Theology, mythology, fantasy and horror, from dungeons and dragons to Skyrim and Mordor. The powers haunt the evening in gothic castles where they're screaming. Wizards cast spells in their towers tonight, exploiting enigmas hidden from our sight. Archaeologists make excavations deep of the ancient tombs where pharaohs sleep. In the dust of ages we chronicles keep, storytelling's power of monsters that creep. Mysteries and majesty is the place for you to learn about this haunted space. From scholarship to manuscripts of old, unlock the secrets of wisdom and gold.
Blessed Sunday, everyone. We have entered this third chapter on the Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty, your favorite 3M podcast by this episode 201, by welcoming back our dear friend and brother, Spencer Owen. By the way, Spencer, I love the background, and I know I always tell you that, but it's so true. I'm almost jealous of not having the same background like you. But yeah, so for tonight, we'll continue dissecting this phenomenal biblical theology book written by a great Eastern Orthodox priest, Father Andrew Damick, and the book is called The Lord of Spirits, and subtitle, An Orthodox Christian Framework for the Unseen World and Spiritual Warfare. So about a month and a half ago, Spencer and I dissected the first half of the book. Now we'll be dealing with chapters 5 onwards. But before we start doing that, Spencer, can you please reintroduce yourself to the audience and tell us about your important work?
Sure. All right. So my name is Spencer Owen. I am a licensed counselor out in Colorado Springs, and I work primarily with people who have experienced spiritual trauma and religious abuse. But I also just in general work within my practice to help heal people who have experienced trauma just generally. And I have a podcast that kind of connects with that called Trauma Informed Church Kid. And on that podcast, we're in the season 2 right now. We're just trying to walk through the Bible, start to finish, or maybe not finish, but walk through the Bible for as long as God wills it, to be able to hopefully reconstruct a picture of God and of theology that is trauma informed. So my tagline is reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. And that's kind of my, there you go. So I have a YouTube channel. I also have, and of course, all of that is on all the major podcast platforms. So that's who I am. That's what I do.
Very cool. I just felt like sharing your
Yeah,
screen. I
no,
did
that's
the same
great.
when I was welcoming back Pastor Anthony Delgado, and I
Yeah,
was like,
mhm,
he was talking about his platform. I was like, let me share your platform because I think there's
yeah,
something about visual appearance that is
yeah,
different to the audience instead of just listening about it. So they
it
just
is.
also love
Mhm,
seeing
yeah.
it and visualizing it.
And it's interesting. I've actually interviewed Pastor Delgado on my, or not interviewed, but I've reviewed his book,
Mhm.
"The Gospel is Bigger Than You Think," on my channel. But it's interesting when you were talking about like the visual has a more potent punch to it. That's something I've realized since like first season one, it was just audio, and so some of it was just me getting used to the format. But season two, I'm starting to get more of the video dynamic. So yeah, you'll see a mix of just if anyone goes and looks at that, they'll see a mix of both just simply audio, but then also some video in there too. So
Yeah, imagine if I welcome you on my Spotify, people wouldn't be able to see that cool picture behind you. So
yeah,
that would
that's
be
right. That's right.
horrible.
That's the
I'll be like,
plan.
let me do this on YouTube.
That's the plan. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so Spencer, we're starting tonight with chapter number 5 in this phenomenal book. And by the way, I have included all the Spencer Owen's links to his website, to his ministry, to his work, as well as the Amazon link to this book, so you can purchase. I make no money out of it, so if I recommend this book, you can trust that it is really a good tool uh, for your spiritual as well as theological um, formation and growth. So we start tonight with again chapter 5, which is titled "The City of Man and the City of God." And as we know, this was one of the famous volumes that Saint Augustine or Augustinian
Mhm.
theology teaches. I'm intentionally using two different pronunciations because different scholars, they can be very technical how you pronounce his name, right?
Yeah.
So here I love that on page 99, Father Damick, he quotes Psalm 48:8. He says, "As we have heard, so we have seen in the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, which God will establish forever." So that's this in our hearts as sojourners. There's this desire and this again imagery of this future city of the New Jerusalem that is coming. But let's go to the very beginning. We see that the first humankind, first people start living in this Garden of Eden, and Eden was on a mountain, as elsewhere said in the Old Testament. How was this paradise portrayed, and how can we compare this imagery with another ancient nearest imageries that compare this type of paradise with walled, protected, sacred ground?
Yeah, so that's the way that the ancient Near East looked at all of their idea of sacred space was as they all put it either in some form or fashion of either within a garden, a walled garden specifically, or on top of a mountain. And there was a couple of reasons for that. One was the idea that the holy and the divine had to be set apart and separated from the common and the ordinary, and so that's one of the reasons for the wall. It's one of the reasons for it being on the top of a mountain. But then the other thing that that was there was that idea that you had to kind of work to get there. You had to like climb the mountain. You had to scale the wall. You had to get around in some way. So there's this idea of like division and separation. And so when the Israelite picture or when the Hebrew picture of that same model came around, and we see Yahweh like with his hands getting his hands dirty in the dust of the earth, forming man and walking with him in the garden. That was a very unique picture in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, and speaking about this location, I believe that something that we call sacred geography among
Mhm.
the scholars, this is very interesting and very important because the beginning of Genesis chapters, they keep saying in the East. So, what is it
Mhm.
about the East versus other parts of the world where the
Yeah.
profane would be put against the sacred?
Yeah, so the East was kind of like a shorthand way of saying away from the divine space. So the West was considered to be where the divine resided, and the East was kind of like away. And of course, we see this in the Bible itself when after Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden, they go to the East. And then when Cain is exiled further from even them, he goes to the East again. And so it's this kind of like sense of progressively moving further and further away. And then the South, which is typically where like Egypt was on the map, was considered to be analogous to Sheol, or the realm of the dead. So to say to go down to Egypt is very often almost synonymous with saying to go into the grave.
Okay, as a foreigner, I have to ask, can we make a parallel when people say here something went south, like something went wrong, right?
That's
But now,
interesting. Ooh,
right?
I don't know. That's a really good point. I never even considered that.
You should speak about this on your podcast, but tell
I
everyone
need
I
to.
came up with this first.
Yeah. Okay. I will make sure that I give plenty of attribution. Yeah. Well, I mean, I have talked about sacred geography on my podcast because like the North was where Mount Zaphon was, and that was considered to be like where Baal resided. And so the North was kind of like the realm of evil spirits and the demonic forces and the darkness. And so
Baal and
yeah,
Bulls of Bashan, yeah.
Right. And so you'll notice you kind of have almost like this encircling effect of like one little point or place of bubble almost of protection and holiness and purity, whether it's Eden or whether it's the tabernacle or whether it's Israel as a kingdom, whatever it is, one little bubble. And then all around it is, down south, we have, death and the realm of the dead. Out east, we have just far away from all life and purity. Up north, we have darkness and demons. And it's like, they're just surrounded by that. And that really was the A&E worldview, is we as modern, for me at least, Americans and just Westerners in general, we tend to see the world more like that evil and darkness and death and decay is contrary to the norm, that it's somehow like a breach of nature for these things to happen. Whereas in the ancient world, they saw the exact opposite. And they thought, like death and darkness and demons are all around us. And our goal is not so much like to ask the question of why, although they did. The bigger goal is more just like, how do we stay in the bubble? How do we stay within the snow globe of protection?
Another very interesting parallel between the ancient Near East and the ancient Near East pagan or Gentile narratives and the Genesis is how in Genesis we have God who puts people and instills them, fills them with His Spirit, and then they're alive, right? But in the ancient Near East pagan or Gentile narratives, we see this different narrative where idols or statues would be put in this type of a paradise of a garden, and then through different rituals such as opening the nostrils, some of them would be called opening the eyes, they would try to infuse this statue with a demonic spirit, the spirit of the fallen Elohim, and they were like, well, then now talk to us, now bless us, now we'll prostrate ourselves in front of you and bow to you and ask you to bless us with rain, with fertility, with all these things. And Yahweh is like, no, I have everything. I don't need anything from you. Because I'm such a loving father, and see all this behind me, like my books, I have all these goodies. I want to give you all these candies, guys, right?
Yeah.
So, but I just wanna relate with you. I just want to meet you in the cool of the day. I don't need anything from you. I already have everything. I just want to share all my goodness and love with you. How different that narrative is from the pagan narrative.
Totally different. And not only on the points that you've mentioned, which I would agree with every single one of those. There's also the thing that in the ancient Near East, and by the way, everything I'm saying is summarizing the content of the book. Like, if anyone wonders, citing my sources, where am I getting this information? Buy the book, get the book. But anyway, yes. In the ancient Near East, the humans were seen as slaves for the gods. Their job, and the priests particularly, but all the whole cultists surrounding one of those idols was to feed the god, to dress the god, to give the god blood that it was demanding, to give it and to keep that sacred space clean from other gods, other evil spirits or unclean spirits that would get in and try to attack. And so, but the thing is that in the ancient Near East conception, the idols and the gods that inhabited them were unable to do any of that without the help of the people. And that's one of the things we see in the Hebrew Bible when you look at like their polemic against idols and idolatry and the gods, is they're saying, let's think about this for a second. You're asking Baal to give you fertility, to give you a firstborn son, or to give you crops, or to win you a war, but he can't even dress himself. And it really is this kind of like really odd juxtaposition of the belief that they had. And that's not just a later caricature or straw man that we're building up. This really truly is the way that the ancient Near East people saw their gods.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now we're switching to the rise of civilization within the same chapter. So now we see what's happening basically in Genesis 4. We see something that literally opposes the place of Eden. We see where people are becoming independent. They're building cities. They're developing new crafts and skills, but not alone. Surprise, surprise. Both from Enoch, and when we compare Genesis narratives, we see that their sudden development of civilization, it's not just merely human. They're getting help from someone, and this is a continuation of rebellion against God, because this city of man, just like Augustine wrote, is contrasting city of God, but not in a good way. It's contrasting him as everything ugly, and was meant to, what Father Damick really well explains, is like all of these things that they're performing over there is meant to say we're independent of God, but not only that, suddenly we're going to make classes among people, and we start going to use and abuse other people because of the wealth and for the benefit of others. So maybe we can also continue talking about these differences between the city of man and the city of God and the first civilizations.
Right. Yeah. I talk about that in season 1 of my podcast when I'm talking about the gods of the nations and the Babel event. I think a lot of the Protestant world tends to overlook the Babel event as like they almost treat it as almost just like, this is how we know that everybody got different languages. When in actuality, it's a much more robust feature. It's a central feature of the entire biblical narrative. So I talk in my podcast about how there are 3 falls of humanity, and the Babel event is the 3rd of those. And what we see there is a bunch of people coming together for a single purpose, which normally we would think, okay, great, unity. But the whole reason why it's there is to show, oh, no. It's not just unity. It's unity around what center? And the center they're unified around is both spiritual, like spiritual beings, giving them illicit technology and knowledge that they're not ready for, so that they will use it to destroy themselves and oppress and hurt and harm other people. But then also the whole purpose behind it is to make a name for ourselves, is what the Bible says. And so we have this picture of a bunch of people coming together for that purpose with those means. And what they're doing is building this giant tower that is supposed to reach all the way up to the heavens. You do not do something, a building project that large at this time period without slave labor. And building a ziggurat like that, the ziggurats were done primarily for sacrifice, sacrificial rituals. And we know that specifically that from excavations in I'm going to draw a blank on the name of it, but I remember like there was, I think it was Edamananki, I believe, is the place.
Oh, Etemenanki, the name of the ziggurat?
Yes, where they found the bed, the ritual bed.
Oh, yeah, Marduk.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the name. Yeah, Etemenanki.
Yes. Yeah. So we have, and again, I'm not 100% certain on the details there. So people, please feel free to do your own research here. But we have uncovered archaeology that demonstrates that shows these huge, oversized ritual beds that were used for, functionally Nephilim rituals. Creating demonic human hybrids. And that was the entire purpose of the Babel event, was to get right back to what happened with the flood. And Yahweh is presented with a dilemma here, not really a dilemma, but the text presents it as such, saying, look, they're doing the same thing as the flood, but I've promised I will no longer deal with this through the flood, through flood means by wiping out the earth. So what do I do? And so he comes down and he disperses them and scatters them and separates them so that unity around the unholy center becomes broken, becomes dispersed. And that's the difference between the city of God and the city of man. It's not so much about unity, division. It's about what is the center of that unity. And even the diversity that we find can be found within the city of God, but it's all diversity centered around a specific unifying principle, in this case, Christ.
Yeah, thank you for that good point. I also want to say that based on First Enoch and one of the church saints, Irenaeus, he says the same, that because this fallen Elohim gave a certain secret knowledge to people starting with Genesis 4, this is why many potions, maybe even alchemy, if we can say that it goes that far back. But the occult basically started at this time. Makeup started, where seduction also started advancing. But more than all of this, as if this was already not bad, metallurgy was developed, and because of that, powerful weaponry started being forged for killing each other. And again, from Genesis 4, as if Genesis 3 was not bad enough, in Genesis 4, we see what leads to what you're saying in Genesis 11 in Tower of Babel, right? So we see how human civilization, if left alone, if left without a parent, man, we're doomed to fail, because there's something in us that keeps making us so selfish, so egoistic and ego focused. They were like, I'm going to enslave someone, I'm going to kill someone, I want to make my name, I want to be like Nimrod, I want to be overtaking large portions of nations, and I want to abuse people, and I don't care if I kill a large number of people, because my name is important, my reputation, my fame, because my desire to leave name behind me. And leaving a spiritual legacy is not bad, but when you leave a legacy by using tools to oppress people and to turn against God, this is where the problem starts. So again, we see from Genesis 3 to 4 to 11, problem after problem, rebellion after rebellion, evil after evil. And big portion of this is when these fallen ones came, they didn't just come in Genesis 6. Even before then, it seems like they're having some connections with people. God knows how that was working, but they exposed them to this secret knowledge, including making swords and spirits and all these. They're called instruments. But what will be instruments? Instruments will be, just like Father Damick says, this will be weaponry. So these were made to fight and kill others. This was something that Yahweh did not plan from the beginning. So maybe if you can speak as a man of God who is also a therapist, what is in us if we're left without God for 5 minutes that make us just go and do the worst of the worst things?
Yeah, boy, that is so true. And first thing I would say is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And not to sit there and from an ivory tower and point fingers at anybody else, but just to say, this is this is absolutely a problem that I continue to wrestle with within my own heart. But I mean, I think the biggest proof of that is the atomic bomb. I mean, we as a species got, uncovered this immense power that has the potential to be used for clean energy, long lasting, lots and lots of to be able to help heal many. And the very first thing we use it for is to kill millions. Now, I'm not even going to get into the argument about like, was it justified? Was it not? Honestly, I think it's irrelevant, because whether it was justified or not, millions were still killed. That is a fact. And that is something that I think we have to kind of wrestle with, instead of just saying, oh yeah, well, it had, a good reason for it. Still killed. Anyway, nevertheless, all that to say, that's a great case study of the depth of depravity that is within the human heart. But I would also point out too, and this is something Tom Holland has been able to write about extensively in his book Dominion. That's a really good book if anyone wants to pick that up. But he takes a look at the course of human history and looks at how human history, what it looked like before the advent of the Judeo-Christian ethic, and what it looked like after the Judeo-Christian ethic became mainstream and solidified its hold and influence. And quite frankly, it is just shocking. Especially when you look at some of the texts in the ancient Near East, like these Assyrian kings will do, and I won't, to avoid you getting, kicked off of YouTube, I won't describe it in detail, but there are some really horrific practices. Like think Ramsay from Game of Thrones level stuff that is happening in Assyria. And it's one of the reasons why when God tells Jonah to go to the capital of Assyria, to Nineveh, he goes, excuse me, no, I'm going the opposite direction. Because these are, Ramsay type of people. Anyway, and when the Judeo-Christian ethic comes along, it really changes our moral intuitions. And that is in many ways, if nothing else, just proof of the truth of that, of the gospel and of this narrative. But it is something that we see pretty clearly in when you start looking at some of the ancient Near East texts. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. And basically this chapter 5 is finished by us expecting the New Jerusalem, where God will restore everything, reconcile everything back to himself, where from the original Eden or paradise, we went to the city of man. We're still in the dominion of the city of man, so to speak. And then God is coming to restore the earth, or reboot to the original order, where now he will even make it even better. So we're switching only briefly to chapter 6, to the worship of God. What is it? What is the gist of this chapter, or maybe the summary, or something that stood out to you the most that you would like to mention to the audience?
Sure. And this is something that I've done a lot of work on different channels. For example, with Faith Unaltered, we did a series of videos responding to Dr. Tom Wadsworth and his approach to things, which is very, very low church and looks at worship in the Greek words for worship, latreu and proskuneo, and tries to see how they're used in the New Testament and how they were used in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. And my conclusion is that he came to some really incorrect conclusions about that, but it's precisely because of the stuff that we see in this book, in the Lord of Spirits book, because in that chapter it talks about how worship is a whole cluster. There's like 6 different worship words. But they all center around 2 things: either prostration, like falling down and bowing down and giving obeisance and reverence and those kind of things to a deity, and also sacrifices. And so you'll see that a lot there's a refrain that keeps getting repeated over and over in like Deuteronomy in particular, where it says, do not go after these nations, do not serve them. There's that serve word. That's the Hebrew there is abar. And that means basically the same thing as give sacrifices. It's the same word that the Levites do when they serve in the temple. Or in the tabernacle, they perform sacrificial rituals. It says, do not serve them or bow down to them. There's the proskuneo, or the prostration. So worship in the Old Testament and in the ancient Near East was basically those two things. And the way that it worked was always about creating a communion, a connection, a relationship between the human and the divine. Which is one of the reasons why when Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 10 about the Eucharist, he talks about the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So the table, their language is food. So and the reason why that makes the connection is because sacrifices in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world in general, were meals. They were a chance to sit down at the table with the divine and eat a meal with them. Certain portions of the food would be either poured out or burned into smoke to then ascend to the divine space as an invitation for the divine to come down, for them to smell the aroma and then come down. And then once they came down, then they would be, like I said, the job of the priest in the ancient Near East was to feed the idols, was to set out food on a literal table for them to eat. The difference, though, with the Hebrew Bible and the sacrifices of Israel, which were wildly different than pagan sacrifices, and that is one of the problems that Dr. Wadsworth keeps doing, is in all of his in his dissertation as well as in his appearances, he always says Jews and pagans did this. Well, he's conflating some really very different things there. That pagan sacrifices worked in the way I've been describing. Jewish sacrifices were almost the inverse in many ways. Like when the smoke ascends, it's not to feed the god. It was seen as being an invitation for him to come down, and then instead of them feeding him, he feeds them. So that's why the priest laid out the what's called the showbread in the King James translation, and that's why there were portions that were burned up, and then portions that were set aside for the priest to eat. That was their being fed by their god. And so it was seen as being this thing where Jewish and pagan sacrifices were very, very different. And the pagan sacrifices, they were trying to, by and large, appease the gods, to make them happy, to get them on their side, to get them to do something they wanted, to do some kind of like magical ritual lever, basically, to pull, to say, okay, I want this, so I'll give you this, and that will get you in my debt in some way. And many, many, many times Yahweh tells them, that is not how I work. I don't eat these things. I don't need them. I don't even want them if your heart's in the wrong place. They smell awful to me if your heart's in the wrong place. So instead, get your heart right and then offer them to me, because then I can actually sit down at the table and eat with you, because I know that you're not planning evil while you're sitting there smiling across the table from me. And so that's really the core difference there between what worship looked like in the ancient Near East broadly and what worship in the Bible looks like. But it still always contains those two key features of bowing down or prostration, and also giving sacrifices, which count as meals with the god.
Thank you. That was really helpful and really beautiful. Amber said pagan ritual was to obligate the deity, and Hebrew liturgy was to be at one with Yahweh. I also want to say that while I was on vacation, end of July, beginning of August, Sean and Amber did a couple of episodes on the Old Testament and New Testament role of these sacrifices and offerings. So yeah, you go there and check a couple of hours of their quality material when it comes to biblical theology and the role of these sacrifices and offerings.
Yep.
Yeah, we are switching now slowly to chapter 7, War Against the Gods, and here we have Father Damick started talking about the differences between myth and mythology, and I love this because again he's always dealing with like, well, before I give you the main thing, the main message, let me first lead you to there so I can first explain you the basic steps so you can understand something more difficult. So he's like, hey, if you think that myth and mythology is the same, it's not. We know what is mythology, but myth is not something false, a fable, something legendary. Rather, myth means simply story. It's from the Greek word mythos, right? So when the Bible speaks about the scholars or people like Jonathan Peugeot or when I interviewed Dr. Louis Marcus, when they use the word myth, they don't think legend. They think rather these true biblical stories of cosmic significance when they're gods, all these spiritual entities, and human in the midst of all of this. So there's this drama, there's this cosmic battle between evil and good. There is all of this happening, but it's true, it's not false. So I love how he starts this chapter and says, well, now you know what is myth, and now go and compare mythology. Let's talk about all of these gods and deities and all these pantheons of gods. And then he says in this book, or especially in this chapter, he'll focus on some of the mythologies and some of the pantheons, some of the divine councils, because there's simply not enough pages in this book. So he's, he was talking about, he was talking about the pro-demon propaganda, and he says, to serve a god, page 137, to serve a god is to engage in the worship, but it is only to offer up sacrifices, but it is not only to offer up sacrifices, but to enter into the whole matrix of rituals involved into the myths of pagan gods. I like that. Then he says, how are pagan stories to be understood? He says, obviously, God's faithful people in the scriptures did not actually believe stories such as how Zeus overthrew his father Kronos and set himself up as the Most High God, nor did they teach that it was true that Baal did something similar by defeating Yam and Nahar and setting up his own father El as the Most High God with himself as the leader of the divine council. Both of these stories are based on something that the Bible says is true. And this is what is true. There was a prominent divine being who attempted to overthrow the Most High God. And then he expounds on that, and we come to this subchapter that I love so much. He called it Saint Basil Bees. Can you please tell us why Father Damick included this subchapter on page 139, and what is this very practical step that he's giving us when we're dealing with pagan sources?
Yes. So basically, the core idea there is that we don't need to. Actually, let me put it this way. And I talk about this some of my podcast. There is a bit of a divide in terms of East and West in Christendom and how we go about doing evangelism. In the West, by and large, this is broad strokes, we tend to walk into foreign places, pagan places, like a tribe out in Papua New Guinea or something like that. And we tend to walk in there and say, hey guys, we have the truth. You have error, you have falsehood, you have lies, we have the truth. Let us tell you why all your stuff is wrong and our stuff is right, and we're going to give you the truth. And then the assimilation and accommodation to their culture is always banging up against that wall. It's always like, well, okay, but only if it doesn't, conflict with the truth, which is our stuff. In the East, they tend to take a different approach. They tend to come at this and say, whenever they do mission work, they tend to come at this and go, where is God here? Rather than going, we are bringing God to them. They come at this and say, where is God here? And that's really the core concept behind this, like St. Basil's Bees, is to say that whenever you're looking at these pictures of Zeus and Kronos and Marduk and Asherah and all these other spiritual beings. You don't need to be afraid of them. You don't need to be to look at them as having totally, completely 100% falsehood every step of the way. But also, you do need to be aware that it is a twisting. There's the pro-devil propaganda. It's a twisting of the real story. That that the reason why there are so many stories within pagan mythology about like dying and rising gods like Osiris or what's the A named god? His name starts with an A in Greek mythology, and I'm drawing a blank on it.
Are you talking about Ares?
No, I think I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, there are lots of different mythologies that have similarities to the Christian myth or to the Christian story, and which is kind of saying the same thing. And the reason why is because these devils, these demons, they know the real story. They were once in the divine council. They know what it's, or they have been taught by those who were once in the divine council. They know the real story, and their job is to go out there and their self-appointed job is to go out there and to twist that story in as many shapes as possible to make it make it such that when they encounter the full truth, they go, oh, well, that's just, we've heard that before. We've heard all that before. This is just old news. And so, and that's a real practical thing that I encounter all the time, where people who I work with and people who I talk to in everyday life are sometimes very bothered by the overlap between Christian stories and the stories in the Bible and the stories in the other cultures. Like, there's a flood narrative in the in New Elish, and there's the Epic of Gilgamesh that has many overlaps with Genesis, and they're a little bit concerned about that. And I always want to ask them, let's pause for a second and ask ourselves, which way is the causal arrow going? We tend to look at those similarities and just automatically assume, because we're skeptical Westerners, that, okay, well, the older stuff, the stuff from Babylon, must have come first, and then the Israelites who were in Babylon heard those stories and said, we're going to make up our own version. Instead of this thing, it's going to actually be, instead of the flood happening because the gods were annoyed at the noises the people were making, it's actually because they were sinning. And that's now our version. But it's actually the causal arrow goes the other direction. That the real story, the real narrative, is something that everybody knew. And the Israelite story is one of those versions of that story. All the others are pro-devil propaganda versions of that story. But the Israelite version is setting the record straight, is saying this is actually what, not just what happened, but also what it really truly means.
That reminds me about 15-ish years ago or so, when that famous Zeitgeist documentary came out. They were trying to find so many similarities between Jesus and dying and rising pagan gods, including in Greek mythology. It also reminds me of people seeing Easter as pagan just because of Ishtar. And it's like if people want to be so skeptical, atheists and Christians, they can find so many similarities between numbers, images, wording. You can say like, well, Jesus rode on a donkey. You can find in some other mythology or story that someone else rode on a donkey, and you can say, oh, see, it's stolen. You can say they went to the marketplace. Oh, see, it says here they went to the marketplace. Bible, false. I mean, you can do this with anything in life. You can say, oh, they sat down and ate. See? And also in other stories, they're sitting down eating. Isn't that suspicious? It's not. It's how stories are working. So it's like, of course, they didn't originate on Mars, and this one on Mercury, and this one on, I don't know, Jupiter. I mean, they have to have some similarities, especially if they're ancient. So it's like, it would be weird if they would not have anything in common. And just because so many ancient stories have flood stories, it doesn't mean it's the same flood. It could have been some of these stories localized flood.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I would be more bothered if there weren't similarities, Because if the Christian story is entirely, completely, 100% novel, that really puts into doubt, for me at least, the universality and applicability of it to all the world. Because if it's just this very unique story that we don't see anywhere else in the world, then it really makes us wonder, like, where was God? Like, was he working with any of these people? Was he trying to work within their culture? Was he um and it's odd that the Christian story comes out of nowhere, or the Jewish story comes out of nowhere. Actually, I see these overlaps as being evidence of the universal truth, of the witness of the Christian story to the universal truth. Now, of course, we might say, why your story and not the Babylonian story, for example? Well, for one, the Christian story has endured, and the Babylonian one hasn't. And the only reason we've found it is because we've uncovered, archaeological artifacts that have been buried for it functionally died out. In terms of like the culture sustaining itself, it functionally died out. Whereas the Judeo-Christian story has sustained itself despite numerous attempts to eradicate it. And that is, in and of itself, a not insignificant case in its favor, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll let your throat rest for a minute. I want to read this very good quotation by the same guy, Saint Basil, who is giving us a method of interpretation when it comes to these pagan narratives and myths and stories. Father Damick dedicates half of the page 142 and the beginning 143. So this is what Saint Basil said when it comes to how to deal with these pagan narratives. He says, "Into the life eternal, the Holy Scriptures lead us, which teach us through divine words. But so long as our immaturity forbids our understanding their deep thought, we exercise our spiritual perceptions upon profane writings, which are not altogether different, and in which we perceive the truth as it were in shadows and in mirrors. Thus we imitate those who perform the exercises of military practice, for they acquire skills in gymnastics and in dancing, and then in battle reap the reward of their training. We must needs believe that the greatest of all battles lies before us, in preparation for which we must do all suffer all things to gain power. Consequently, we must be conversant with poets, with historians, with orators, indeed with all men who may further our soul's salvation." No wonder then that Paul knew all these Greek poets and philosophers when he steps in Acts 17. Just as dyers prepare the cloth before they apply the dye, be it purple or any other color, so indeed must we also, if we would preserve indelible the idea of the true virtue, become first initiated in the pagan lore, then at length give special heed to the sacred and divine teachings, even as we first accustom ourselves to the sun's reflection in the water, and then become able to turn our eyes upon the very sun itself. End quotation. And now this is what Father Damick says. He actually says here, who St. Basil, that we must become first initiated in the pagan lore, then at length give special heed to the sacred and divine teachings, learn the pagan texts before turning to the Bible. But why? Because we acquire the basic skills we need for reading and interpretation with this lesser literature before we can understand the deeper things of the Bible, the shadows and the reflection we apprehend before we gaze upon the sun. Thus, far from telling Christians to avoid anything that does not have a Christian label on it, St. Basil says that we must be conversant with poets, with historians, and all these people. And I'll say this, I was shocked in a positive way when I was interviewing Dr. Louis Marcos, who's a Christian professor, academic, book author, who told me that sometimes instead of his devotional Christian books, he goes through the pagan Greek literature, because so many of their heroes are in a way reflecting Christ, especially through their sacrifices and sense for justice and heroism. So he will tell me, I would sometimes go through their books and read them as my devotion to God, because all of these books are are holding traces of truth, the seed of truth that also Father Damick says, even though I know they're not Christian in origin, but it doesn't mean they're all horrible. And now St. Basil says the same, and Father Damick agrees. What is your comment on this? And I know some of my either friends or fans of the podcast who are who are opposing this, they may be upset with us, but still, let's talk about this.
No, that's real. Because I know, like, I grew up in a world that looked sideways at everything that was not explicitly labeled and out as Christian. I remember, for example, when I was growing up as a teenager, I really liked music. I was listening to all kinds of different music. And very often the question that was always posed to me is, well, did they talk about God in their lyrics? I'm like, well, no. And, but to me, I was always baffled by that. Like, why does that matter? Like, is God?
Does the Song of Solomon talks about boobs or God? I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. Like, romantic is not evil or bad.
Right.
Yeah, it's perverse and abuse is bad, but not everything does not mention God is bad. I'm sorry, I just had to say this because I heard in different churches, or if the music or this is not glorifying God, then guess who is it glorifying? I'm like, dude, you're teaching kids that everything is evil if it's not from the Bible or mention God. It could be, but you cannot put everything black and white and overgeneralizing. Like, okay, I bought this to play board games. I never played tabletop D&D games. I bought this. I have two packages. Guess what? In that board game, tabletop game, maybe God won't be a measurement. Maybe there'll be gods. Doesn't mean I'm going to hell. That's how people are. Even with music, I'm like, what is wrong? Like, I would play Guns N' Roses, I would play Foreigner, and they have the best romantic ballads, like from 80s, 90s, and whatever. Like, this is the time when I was growing up. What is wrong with that? Unless the song is really, truly, honestly, genuinely bad in the lyrics. Otherwise, if it's mere romantics, like one of my favorite songs, but it comes from the band Foreigner, I Want to Know What Love Is. Dude, what is wrong with that song? Especially if you're watching the video, they invite the church choir at the end of the video. And it's like, so are you telling me people who listen to this, they're worshiping the devil? Like, come on.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, this is another one of those east-west divides. To go back to Augustine, he postulated what's called the nature-grace divide. The idea being that the state of nature, of human nature, of all nature around us, is such that it cannot have any merit before God or any validity or value unless there is supernatural grace injected into it to then make it worthy, to make it meritorious. And of course, he used that in the context of like human behaviors and choices to say that even if someone, and this is something Augustine really truly did say, even if someone does something very altruistic, like a mother gives up her life for her baby, without an explicit and overt injection of divine grace into that act, Augustine would say that is non-meritorious. That doesn't do anything. In fact, it's not even neutral. It's part of what he called the damnable mass of humanity, or the behaviors of, or just the creation that is prepared for destruction. And so in the West, we tend to think of it in that kind of way of like, is it us or God, in this exclusionary sense, that where glory is a zero-sum game. And whereas the East looks at it and says, no, God is everywhere, filling all things. Or like Paul says in Acts 17, in him we live and move and have our being. Quoting a pagan philosopher there. Exactly.
And talking about Zeus, by the way, which Paul then takes and overturns just like Moses did for Baal riding on the clouds. No, it's Yahweh riding on the clouds. Now in him we can move. Well, no, not in Zeus, but in God. So it's like God allows us to use these pagan sources of information, baptize them in Christ, and use them and preach the gospel. It's not wrong. This is why I have Christian friends who are making tabletop games, and you still play with the same type but they're spreading the gospel through the tabletop games. You cannot condemn someone who is reading Harry Potter. And no, I never read Harry Potter. I'm just giving example. You can't condemn these people. They're going to hell because they play D&D games or reading Harry Potter and fantasy, for God's sake.
Right. I know. Which, I mean, like, the downstream effects of that are really, really bad. Where not only it's not just a matter of like, oh, you miss out on some fun times, which, like, I started doing RPG games for the very first time this last year, and I really like it and enjoy it. But again, it's because of the whole satanic panic and D&D stuff, during the 80s and the 90s and all those things. But so it's more than just like you miss out on fun. I've seen it happen in the psychology world where people will have a very skeptical eye toward anything that secular psychology puts out, purely on that basis, on no other basis other than in their work, they do not cite the Bible. And that's not a fringe view. That happens.
And because they would see everything is demonic. Oh, what psychology supposedly, according to some Christians, what psychology is trying to explain cannot be cured because it's all demonic. I'm like, how do you know? Are you God Almighty?
Yeah.
How do you know behind every possible depression, sickness, or illness is a demon? How do you know?
Yeah.
No one but God knows this. And you're putting these people down who went to school, who are trying to help people. Yeah, they're imperfect. Their pills may not always work, but they're trying. Put now how much money the pharmaceutical companies are making. Let's talk about doctors who are trying to help people. You cannot tell me none of this works. You just lay your hand and you heal everyone. Boom, done. Like, we don't need any of these things because, like you said, they're secular. I'm like, that's such a narrow-minded view. What for people who don't get healed? Are they not supposed to go see a doctor, including a therapist?
Yeah. And not just narrow-minded, unbiblical. Because, as we've discussed, there is the sacrificial system utilized concepts and methods and means and everything else from the pagan world to be able to teach truths to the Israelite people. So this is as old as the Bible itself, to be able to utilize what we see in the world around us and say God is in everything. There is a lot of times we have to look really, really hard for it. And we have to spit out a lot of stuff to get to it, to get to the meat. And some things just simply aren't worth. There's so much bones and so little meat that it's not helpful. You really should stay away from it. And that's part of the Basil's bees idea, is that the bee doesn't just go to every flower; it goes only to certain flowers. And so that's kind of the idea behind that metaphor. But lest anyone think that this is only a perspective for like Eastern Orthodoxy or something like that. This is something that even people like C.S. Lewis have noted. One of the things he said was, if we want to make people good, if we want to make our children good Christians, we have to make them good pagans first, which for him meant steep them in the mythology and the mythos and the worldview of classical literature and the classics. And from that, they kind of like shape their heart, or as we might say in Greek, the nous. It shapes their perceptual ability to be able to receive the full truth when it comes. So anyway.
Isn't it, by the way, funny that some pastors and Christian parents would be against mythologies and all these pagan stories, but then they would love Marvel and DC movies? I'm like, but you don't understand. Like, this is the same thing. It originates from the same source of imagination. So you're okay watching Captain America and Hulk, but then you will tell your kid not to read about Hercules. It's like, it's the same thing, just repackaged. Mm-hmm. It's weird.
Absolutely is. Well, I mean, Hercules is actually a character in Marvel, but nevertheless.
Yeah. Okay, so to be done with this chapter now, Father Damick assesses some of the biggest, deities in the ancient Near East, including Baal, Marduk, Asherah, and he briefly then mentions Chamish or Camish, based on pronunciation. I know that Amber will be judging our Hebrew pronunciation. Moloch and some of these big dudes from the ancient years. And then he's done with the chapter by saying this. He says, the gods of these pagan nations are fallen angelic beings, rebels who turned away from God. Their primary sin was seeking to turn the worship of humans away from God and toward themselves. Spiritual warfare, therefore, consists primarily of God making war against these demonic enemies, opposing them and rendering judgment against them. We ourselves are called to wrestle against the rulers, against the authorities, cosmic powers, and this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, as we see in Ephesians 6:12. So how do we do that? We do it precisely by doing the works of God, by being faithful, by being true sons and daughters of our Father in heaven. Sometimes people think that spiritual warfare consists of a specialized kind of prayer or discipline called exorcism. And of course, the church has particular prayers of exorcism, but then he continues saying that it's usually what is considering spreading the light in the darkness. It's not just exorcism, but it's practicing good deeds or religious acts, practicing beauty, order, love, humility, kindness, and justice to our neighbor. And by doing this, we are fighting and opposing these fallen principalities, because they are not like your demons who possess people so you can exercise them. These are principalities that only God can deal with. And now we're switching to the last two chapters of the book. Chapter 8, routing the gods, or defeating the gods. And here, Father Damick is speaking about the old kingdom. That was precisely the kingdom of the demonic power. So he's connecting with where the previous chapter ended. And this old kingdom, demonic kingdom, was characterized by ignorance, enslavement to wickedness and magic. Christ's coming was about to was about the abolition of death, the defeat of the last enemy. We read this in 1 Corinthians 15. This is why after Jesus rose from the dead, he sent out the apostles to participate in his reclamation of the world. The authority God had given to the angelic guardians who fell into evil after Babel was given back to Christ, which is why he links that return of authority with the word therefore when he sends the apostles out. That is because he had taken the authority back from the demons, and now he can delegate them to the apostles. They're the new patrons and guardians of the nations. So maybe we can start talking about these things. We're starting with page 156, about this last enemy, our role, how we fight in this spiritual warfare and things of that sort.
Yeah. So I would say that what that looks like practically is spiritual warfare is any time that you're taking a piece of creation, which includes people, which includes land, which includes objects, which, all these things. Like, the world is not disenchanted. It was not in the Bible. It is not now. So any time you take any part of creation that has been claimed or has had a claim put on it by the forces of death, darkness, demons, anything like that. And anytime we take that and we reclaim it for God, for the kingdom of light, that is spiritual warfare. That is, the supreme act of that is what Paul talks about in Colossians 1:13-14, when he says that we have been transferred or translated from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. And then he goes on to talk about that happened through redemption, because that's what the phrase, that's what reclaiming things is. Redemption is a transfer of possession, of ownership, of taking things from one owner or one claimed owner, whether, legitimate or not, and then transferring it back to its rightful owner. And so whenever we go out there I'll use a really practical example. My job as a counselor, I look at the people that I work with as having been touched by the kingdom of darkness. Does that mean they're demon possessed or they're to blame? Absolutely not at all. We live in a fallen world that has been reclaimed, but is, D-Day has happened, but we still have to advance and take over all the way to Berlin, to take over, the entire European continent. And it's the same sort of thing now. Like, Christ, in his death and resurrection, incarnation, death and resurrection, that was D-Day, and the battle has been the war is over functionally, but what we have to do is we now have to like make that victory real by reclaiming every corner of creation back for God, because that's where it came from anyway. He's the rightful possessor and owner of all creation. And so when with my clients, when they come in and they have been, like I said, touched by the forces of darkness by maybe somebody else, some other person, who let those forces of, devils and demons animate them to abuse them. And that is a contact with that kingdom of death and darkness. And that contact, just like in the Old Testament, leaves a stain, leaves a taint, it degrades the purity and the wholeness, the shalom that God has designed for his creation. And when I work with them to work on healing and recovery from trauma, to me, that is reclaiming reclaiming people from the kingdom of darkness and bringing them back into the kingdom of light. Can I do that like Jesus did? No. However, like Paul says, for this end I strive mightily with all his power that works within me. Synergy. So hopefully, God willing, the work that I do here on earth will be revealed, and like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 3, it will be revealed as gold and not hay or stubble when the consuming fire comes and burns it all up. I don't know, but that's not my job to figure that out. That's God's job to assess that. My job is just to be faithful, to do the work here and now. And to me, doing counseling work is spiritual warfare.
Yeah, I basically see you, or any Christian other therapist who's faithfully doing their job, as an extended arm of Christ, participating in what the New Testament calls that God is reconciling to himself the creation back. So you're basically bringing people to the Lord's table, so to speak. I don't mean necessarily Eucharist. I just mean you're bringing them in the union with God so they can be whole again, not just mentally, not just spiritually, not just emotionally, but overall, all in all. I have two quick questions from Ember because we have to pay attention to the time before we're done with this chapter, because we have one more chapter.
Yeah,
because it's one of the most fascinating chapters talking about the saints.
Yeah.
So the first chapter from Ember. Who's your favorite ancient pagan deity? You have 2 seconds. I'm out. Done.
Oh, man.
That was the answer. Oh, man. Okay. Next question. Who's your second?
Osiris. There we go. Osiris.
Okay. Second question, Amber. We're done with questions for tonight. Please send them tomorrow through email. Second question for Spencer. How was the disconnect from the ritual/liturgical contributed to spiritual trauma? Oh my God, it can take 2 hours.
Yeah, right. This is really, I'll do this really briefly. A disembodied and disenchanted world. That's the simplest way to put it. When people have a disconnect between their brains and their bodies, and they're told that that's the way they're supposed to be, that's where we get dysphoria. That's where we get problems with a sense of identity and being in the world. And it also causes major problems when people are told that all you have to do is believe, like in your head, and then you'll be good. And it doesn't depend on your work, but yet you're supposed to still do work. So like there's this really disconnected and dissonant sense of what it means to be a follower of Christ, to be to be faithful when faith is divorced from faithfulness. Like they really have to be tied in together, or else we wind up with things like where people commit some kind of abuse against someone and they say, well, Jesus has forgiven me. I have confessed it to him and he has forgiven me, so you should forgive me too. And if you can't, then you're holding yourself up as being worth more than Jesus. So this is clearly now your problem, because you can't forgive that I have abused you. And stuff like that that's what happens when we disconnect the mental and spiritual from the embodied reality of life. So.
And that's pure manipulation. I believe this also happens in the
Oh, yeah.
church. When I say church, I mean capital C, in the global church. You can abuse biblical verses like that, and instead of most honestly apologizing to the victim, you can just say a short sentence like that, and then boom, as if you're done. But the victim may be suffering till their last breath.
Right.
It's seriously messed up.
Yes. Yes.
See, now you made me think about this, and now I'm getting sad.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said for like the ritual liturgical practices of penance, of doing penance, which is not trying to like add or earn or add to or earn or anything like that. It's just simply acknowledging the reality of our embodied existence, to say that you can't just simply do some spiritual thing in your own head, in your own heart, between God and you, and expect that to be real in a enfleshed, embodied, non-Gnostic world. You just can't. So.
Okay, thanks. Now we're switching to pages 165 and onwards, staying in the same chapter, which Father Damick titled Killing the Dragon. And here he goes to different predominantly Nordic sources, where such in Beowulf, but also some other sources he mentions also Thor and the Midgardian serpent. Then he mentions Fafnir and other pagan Nordic scriptures, where basically there's this, if I can call it an archetype of an enemy that is like the devil in the Bible. It's the serpent, it's the dragon. So just like in the Bible, we see in these pagan narratives, we see that there's a hero, there's a god or a demigod in these pagan scriptures that is dealing with this main enemy, with the big boss. Like playing video games, by the end of every level there's this big boss waiting for you. So this big boss at the end of their whole mythology and the whole in their realm of existence will be this divine serpent, right? And then their deities, their kings, their heroes are going and fighting against them. And sometimes, guess what? Their heroes in their stories die just like Jesus dies when he's dealing with a serpent. But unlike their stories, we have God that cannot die, so he's resurrected, he's coming back. So when all of these examples are done and compared by Father Damick, then he finishes the chapter by this. End of page 171. He says, I told the story above of the slaying of Fafnir by Sigurd. Sigurd was a hero. This story appears on carved wooden doorposts that adorn the outside of some hasty stave church, a 12th or 13th century church in Norway. The church itself no longer exists, but after it was demolished in the 17th century, the carvings were reused in other buildings and are now on display in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, which is the capital of Norway. And now, this is the best part. Why would Norwegian Christians put these images on their church? I once had someone suggest to me that it was to lure in pagans who would see Sigurd on the outside of the building, then presumably enter and stay, and even though the inside of the building was clearly Christian. So this was basically, people would see, well, this was like basically trying to use the bait to lure the pagans in the church and convert them. But then Father Damick says, but this makes no sense, however, as the church was built centuries after the last Norse pagan was baptized into Christianity. There would have been no pagans around to be lured in by this religious bait and switch. But now consider another object, the Frank's cat. Okay, so he's giving more examples for which we don't have time, but basically saying that that people, even though they converted and they were faithful to Christ, they saw this imagery in some of the earlier pagan writings that basically were resembling about the true myth, the true, what Tolkien and C.S. Lewis called the true myth. And that's the true story, the true narrative of Christ coming down and slaying this arch enemy who is the devil himself. Any summary, any thoughts on this chapter?
It's really hard to do anything better than Father Damick has done there. But I just love that image of like dragon slaying. I mean, that's something we see all over every culture, Western, Eastern, all over. Which again, like I said before, tells me there's something to that. If it keeps, like you called it an archetype earlier, that's from a Jungian sort of sense. That's a universal pattern that our brains recognize, not because we have collectively hallucinated it and created it out of thin air, but because it really actually has a foundation in actual reality. That's fundamentally the difference between nominalism and realism. And so it's like we keep having these stories pop up in all cultures, spread out, about dying and rising gods, about defeating a dragon and slaying or slaying a serpent, or um, or about the need to connect with the gods through a meal and through obeisance and bowing down. Why would we think that is a pure fiction? If it is a fiction, it's something that everybody collectively has, without any contact, decided they're all going to hallucinate together. That seems far less likely to me than the fact that, no, actually, this is saying something real about reality.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, we're now dealing with the last chapter in the book, the sons of God. Um, Father Damick says that Christians are called to be saints, but then he says, well, what is actually the opposite of a saint? And the answer will surprise, I don't know, I would say at least 90% of the audience. He says
Yeah.
in the Bible, to be opposite of a saint, it's to be a giant. Can you please
Yep.
help us understand how is the giant or a tyrant being opposite from a saint from biblical perspective?
Yes.
And you can mention any saints or church fathers if you would
Sure.
like to.
Sure. So, and this is going to be something that some Protestant friends of mine will be a little bit confused by, because we're used to talk about saints just being equivalent to the word believers. And there is a sense in which that can be used in that way, but that is not the primary sense in which it is used. The best way to think of saints are people who have been, whose lives, either on this earth and or in the next life, have been energized by divine realities. Now, I say divine, and I mean that in both directions. There are sons of God who are who follow him, who actually obey him, and so being energized by them would be like being energized by angels, more or less, relatively speaking. Or there are sons of God who have rebelled and are fallen, and being energized by them instead. I did an episode of my podcast last season called Permeable Creatures. And we were talking about how that's how humans are made to be. Because we are hybrid beings, spirit and flesh, we always have a connection to the spirit world. We always are part of and able to commune and connect with that reality. And the question isn't, are we or are we not? The question is, who are we communing and connecting with? And so a saint is someone who has gone well, not all the way, but as far as one can go, very, very, very far down the path of being energized, not by their own will, not by their own spirit necessarily, but by the Spirit of God or the Spirit of the sons of God, who are, the angels, the saints who have gone before us, all those things. Compared to the other end of the spectrum is the giants. And what that is anyone who has gone so far in the other direction that their life on this earth and beyond is energized by the fallen Elohim, the fallen sons of God, the angelic demonic spirits. And that can look like possession, but it doesn't always, like, that's actually kind of a step on the road to the giants. So that's probably the quickest summary I can come up with.
Yeah, and what is very helpful that both Dr. Heiser and Father Damick says, look, when we're talking about giants, don't think about some, humanoid creatures that are tall as a building. Just look at them, yes, tall, and yes, powerful and strong, humans, but they are humans. They are something else as well. But just as God, Jesus is God, but he's also human. So look at them in that way. They will look like us. Some of them will have 6 fingers, 6 toes. Okay, yeah, they are powerful. They are strong. They're tall. But that's not necessarily what characterizes them as giants. What characterizes them as giants is that they have evil nature. They're prone to be
Right.
tyrants, to destroy everything. They're bloodthirsty. Was it in the Book of Giants, which is of course not part of the Old Testament, that they're like mentioned that once when, and this is of course given as the narrative and the context of Genesis 6, like why would God throw the flood just like that? Well, it would be because they would not just performing what they were performing, but after killing, eating animals, they were like killing and eating people and even going after each other. So when God saw that as basically opposing everything that he planned when he was creating to be, everything was perverted. I don't mean necessarily just sexual, I mean perverted and abused in general. This is what to be a giant, to be a tyrant, to present and do and think everything that opposes God. God is holy. Well, you're completely unholy. We all have unholy thoughts, words, and actions. If someone is like that, I'm too. But this is a permanent condition of someone that doesn't want to change. They don't care about God. They don't care about godly things. They don't care about their neighbors. They don't. And when I say neighbor, I mean any human being. So this is to be a tyrant. This is to be a giant in a spiritual sense. So in that sense, that opposes a saint. Saint is not someone who is perfect. Saint is someone who is justified by God, and they're loving God and people as the best they can. And in the Eschaton, in the eternal now, they will be turned more to look into Christ likeness. That is the complete opposite. What he gives here as an examples on pages 187 in the subchapter called Demonized Humans. He says the point is that the events of Genesis 6 and the many other appearances of giants in the Old Testament all indicate one thing. It is possible for humans to descend very deeply into evil. Yep. Humans have the possibility for demonization, not to turn into demons, but to become functionally like them even after that. And here, Spencer, I was thinking about, have you seen Stranger Things? Do you like Stranger Things?
I have seen the first 2 seasons, and then I stopped because it went a little bit too far for me.
Dark, huh?
But I am familiar with several of the concepts continuing on.
I don't know, in the first 2 seasons there's Lord Vecna. Have you heard about him?
Yes, I have, but again,
okay.
I didn't.
So Lord Vecna, he's a powerful demonic entity, but he was a human being. He was a human boy named Henry who was experimented on, just like Eleven, the main girl of the TV show. But then he eventually transformed into a monster, a very powerful monster. So when I was reading this chapter, this week, I was thinking like, demonized humans. Well, who is the better, in my mind, who is the better example than Henry in Stranger Things, who turned into Lord Vecna? He's nothing like humans anymore. Not just in outward likeness, inside he is nothing human anymore. He's completely turned to the dark side. If you think Darth Vader, this dude is 10,000 times worse and uglier and meaner. So like he's completely in that type a giant because he's completely demonized. So can we maybe speak both from the biblical, this book perspective, but also from the perspective of you as a therapist? How far is too far for someone where it's like there's no point of return, or there is a still chance for someone as long as they're alive to come together? And I know the answer is yes, but it's not so probably easy in practice dealing with someone who has gone too much dark. Like when their heart is hardened, how difficult for them is to preach the gospel.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I do not specialize in people who have gone that far down that road. Like I know there are people who work with like sex offenders or, in the correctional facilities, or as like criminal profilers for the FBI or whatever. I do not work in that area. And so that is definitely, I'm kind of speaking out of my area of expertise here, specifically, but of course, broadly, I have, psychological expertise. Here is one thing I would say broadly is that every choice we make wires our brain to then for the next choice. So I talk about it to my clients is like we have like a stimulus, reaction, response, feedback loop, where something happens outside of us. Someone says something nasty to us or whatever, and then we have a just automatic, non-choice reaction. We just something like that, and then from there we have a chance to respond. How do we handle that autonomic, not avolitional reaction? If we choose to feed into it, like we go, hey, and then we choose to go, how dare you, and bleep and everything else, that sequence between reaction and response loops back in, and then the next time we encounter the same stimulus, we are trained to do the exact same thing the next time. And that continues every time we encounter that stimulus and we have that reaction and then we have the same response. It keeps wiring us to do the same thing. So and that's one of the reasons why when I work with people in counseling, they come in and the consistent theme they keep saying is, I feel stuck. I feel like I can't get out of whatever it is, whether it's depression, anxiety, marital problems, whatever it is. And the reason why is because of this feedback loop system. The more that we do something, the more likely it becomes we will continue to do it. And so, and that works in both directions. And that's a concept in psychology we call neuroplasticity. So I tell my clients that is both great news and bad news at the same time. The bad news is you're working against a feedback loop that has lots of iterations and cycles already. So the groove, the mental biopsychological groove is very, very deep. And you have to fill in that trench now. And also, at the same time, build a new trench. That's hard work. It's long work. It takes a long time. Good news is it does work. And that is the way that our brains are designed, is that neuroplasticity occurs throughout the entire lifespan. So it is never too late. It is never past being able to change those patterns. Granted, the longer we stay in the pattern and the more times we repeat it, the stronger it becomes and the harder it is to change. That is also true. Harder does not mean impossible, though. And we always have the capacity. Now, are there people on the far end of the spectrum who have lost that capacity? Again, not my area of expertise. I think it's absolutely possible, without a doubt. Here is one thing I do know, though, and this is something I talk about in my podcasts, and this is something actually Father Damick talks about in his book when he talks about the harrowing of Hades. There is a strong tradition within the Christian worldview that death can be seen as a mercy, that separating the flesh from the spirit, the soul from the body, is one of the ways in which, like Paul talks about, that hand this guy over to Satan, so that for the destruction of the flesh and the salvation of his soul. Or like Peter talks about in 1 Peter, where it says that the people in the days of Noah, we were just talking about that with the Nephilim, people in the days of Noah were judged in the flesh so that they may be saved in the spirit on the day of the Lord. And it talks about Christ going down and preaching to the spirits in prison. So again, there's this, like, it's hints. None of it is ever doctrine and dogma that is stated explicitly, But there are strong hints that if the flesh, if the body is an impediment to the spirit being saved, then we need to separate those two so that we can then fix the soul that has been, polluted by all this stuff, and then rejoin them in the resurrection so that they can be remade whole. But having said that, though, that's not something I ever want to say, okay, let's just plan on that happening. Because for one, the things that are said in the Bible about Gehenna are very, very, very dire. And they are not something to like, okay, that's what I'm going to roll my dice on. But then the other reason too is because everything we do in the body lasts. This is not like the separation of body and soul means, okay, now you get a zero state and you're back to normal. No, like we are who we are because of the choices we make. And that is true whether we have a body or whether we don't. And so we have to really wrestle with that and be very honest with ourselves and realize that we don't know what's on the other side and what opportunities will be given to us on the other side. What we do know is we're told to be faithful now. And we are told that everything that we do now will matter in eternity, both for good and for evil, to make us more like saints or to make us more like giants.
Thank you. I have the last question when it comes to the whole book, and it has to deal with our role and our position and our dominion in the New Jerusalem. And this was particularly interesting to me, and it will be very challenging to people who are not Orthodox or Catholics. And I think it is very important to mention. But before that, I do apologize. You mentioned something that hit in my heart on a personal level, so I want to ask you. Before my dad passed away a little over a year ago, and he spent his whole life without God. Before he got the last stage of cancer, he's been smoking for over 50 years. So he discovered late when he was already spitting blood. Before that, a year before that, he fell from a roof and injured his legs. So sometimes when I'm thinking about my dad and his soul, I'm thinking, God, did you allow this to happen first with the roof and then with cancer? Because my dad was not looking for you in his life. At least, well, he was. He had his ritualistic little prayer in the morning. He sometimes goes to church, but he didn't live a life that would be holy or seeking for God, obeying God, reading the Bible, taking sacraments, even though he got baptized, but I don't think it was for the right reasons. Anyway, so I'm thinking sometimes, and this hit me when you mentioned 5 minutes ago, that sometimes God can separate the soul or the spirit from the body for our good. So I'm thinking sometimes, God, I didn't say God caused. I didn't say it. God doesn't cause evil. But did you allow my dad first to, fall from the roof and go through this pain with his leg in order to seek you? And because that didn't work for a whole year, then he discovered he has cancer, so that even though if he's dying, he would reach out to you. And that gives me comfort because before he died, I was able to see him a couple of months before he passed away. I was able to see him. I went to Europe, and I told him he has to give away, his life to God. And because some people tricked him and hurt him in his life, and he was very vengeful, I told him to surrender this to God and let just God deal with that. After that, I had to come back to the States. And later on, because dad's cancer was getting worse, my mom wouldn't put him on the phone so I can see him, because she said, I don't want you to see him in his last days. He was looking horrible. But then if I would send him Bible verses, my mom would write it down, and he would tell me that he's reading them every day. And that's sort of like my dad. My dad would read, and I would strategically send not many and not complex verses about Jesus being the Lord, to repent, confess your sins unto the Lord, that there's promise of the afterlife and resurrection. And then when he was not even able to talk so much, he sent a message to my mom saying that he says, I'm praying on the balcony by facing the Orthodox Church, because the Orthodox Church is like 5 minutes walk from our balcony. And my God is like, it's emotional because it's my dad. And I'm like, God, I'm not saying God killed my dad, of course, but I'm saying, did you allow this? Because first time he didn't want to listen. Did you do this as an act of love, even though we miss him, right? but either can something like cancer bring and separation. Yeah, the body was suffering, and because of that, he was saying and screaming every day, "God, take me, take my life," because he couldn't live anymore. When he wasn't able to breathe, he got a 4-stage lung cancer. So I'm thinking only because what you mentioned, could God be separating his soul and body because he was ready to go? And in that course, after I left, I can only hope that he made that transition of just saying yes to God, not that he was reading the Bible, going to church, whatever deeds of religious actions we expect us to do as Christians, right? Especially in the evangelical world, have to read the Bible every day, you have to go to church faithfully. These are good things, but these do not necessarily qualify you to be a Christian. Otherwise, early Christians who didn't have the Bible, how would they even fit in that narrative? But anyway, so when you're talking about this, I'm like, God, could you be even better than we expect? And of course, the answer is yes. But I'm just, but it's not a theological question. It's an emotional question to our Father God. God, could you be so good that you saved my biological dad, even though he wasn't? He believed in God. He had his, like I said, morning prayers, but he wasn't a man who would follow God. That was clear. And I'm like, could you have done this as a result of answering prayers for the last couple of decades because you're so good, and then you separate, but in the eternal now, when we're going to face God, you would put his renewed body and soul because of the work you could have done in his heart. I don't know that. And that gives me hope.
Gosh. Yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh, my heart breaks to hear that. And not because it's just so hopeless, but just because of the pain that he had to go through. And I think, even though I can't speak into anybody's specific situation, there's a couple of things that I know to be true about God. One is that he is always for us. He is never against us. And so, at least in this life, as long as there is hope remaining. And so whenever bad things, evil things happen to us, it is the forces of death and darkness trying to tear us down. But I also know that because God is for us, he is always working within the evil to bring good about. So and then I talked about this in my podcast when I talked about suffering, that every single moment of suffering is a chance for us to repent, for us to use that as a way to become truly human is probably the best way to say that. And where we are on that journey and is something God alone knows. And that's the other thing I would say too, is that I am not the judge. None of us are the judge. God alone is the judge. And the other thing definitely that needs to be said is that judge here does not mean implacable. Judge means merciful. God is gracious and compassionate and long-suffering and full of mercy and delights in forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. And if anyone is ever outside of his salvation, it's because they've chosen it, not because he has. And those, I don't know if any of that is going to be comforting or not, but it is the truth that I believe is true about God. And I know that, like Saint Sophrony of Essex said, if any soul is in hell, you may be certain that Christ is there with them. The idea is that he is always pursuing us, no matter what, all the way to the very end.
Thank you so much, Spencer. And we can be done with the episode, but you just summarizing the last few subchapters of the last chapter. Basically, in Luke 20, Jesus said about us that we will be like angels, or some translation that Father Damick quotes says equal to angels. So we have subchapters, you will be like angels, angel language for humans, angel tasks for humans, and angel thrones for humans. And I know this will be very challenging for people, including theosis, but how can we summarize this? Because I was posting on social media these few last pages of this chapter, because I want our evangelical and Protestant brothers and sisters to start thinking deeper when it comes to being a saint taking positions that the fallen Elohim had, but after rebellion they lost it. God including us as humans in His heavenly family, and what Paul meant by humans, that don't you know that you will be ruling cities and you'll be judging angels. So God's intent for humans were never to be labor like in mythologies, where these fallen gods and goddesses, they couldn't stand humans. They wanted to, in one of the stories, they wanted to annihilate humans because they're too loud. So how is our position, our image of God, thrones that will inherit, functions that will inherit, and theosis, how is this helping us understand the love and plan of God that He always had for humanity, versus these angels that we always see them as semi-divine, they're like so above us, but actually God's love and plan for humans could be even bigger than for humans.
Yep. Well, that is the gospel. That's what Paul talks about in Galatians 3. That is considered by most to be his first letter that he ever wrote in Galatians. And in Galatians 3, especially verse 9, he talks about how Abraham had the gospel preached to him. And that gospel was, all the nations will be blessed through you. Now, when we go back to reading about what Abraham's blessing was, it was you will be like the stars. And the stars were considered in the ancient world where Abraham would have heard that phrase. He would have thought, oh, you mean my descendants are going to be like gods? They're going to be the divine, sons of God, the ruling powers. Wow, that's going to be amazing. And yes, that's the quality aspect. The quantity aspect is also there. Of like they'll be numerous as the sand on the seashore, and those kind of things. So that was the promise given to Abraham. That was the gospel. And that's why when Paul goes on later on in Galatians 3 to talk about what happened on the cross, he says that was done so that the blessing of Abraham may come to the nations, that they may receive the promised Spirit. And so that is exactly what we've been talking about with saints, is that the blessing of the promise given to Abraham was your descendants will become divine beings. And the way in which that will happen is the Spirit of God himself, the creator of the universe, will be poured out on all flesh, like in Joel 2. And then that will energize all of creation with divine life. Now, it still requires participation and synergy with that divine life. So our spirit cooperating with his spirit. But what made it possible was the incarnation and the death and the resurrection of Christ. And because of that, the promise to Abraham will be able to come where the Spirit is poured out everywhere. And that is ultimately the gospel.
Spencer, I truly, most honestly enjoyed this time. I'm sorry for holding you a little over an hour and a half.
Okay.
I really appreciate your time, your knowledge, your wisdom, the way you approach as a therapist and also as a theologian. TNT, that's a wonderful, it goes wonderful with the ministry and with the work you do. I'm really thankful. I see that people enjoy too. The whole time we had a number of people who didn't chat, but they've been watching us throughout the whole team. I'm also thankful for them. This Friday, I think I will have to go back, but I think it's 4 p.m. Central Time. I will be interviewing Dr. Tremper Longman, who wrote a number of books. So we'll be talking about his book, God is a Divine Warrior. I think that's how it's called. It's a book called Few Decades. I just have to be very honest. I contact people all the time. Let's say I contact 15 people. 5 never respond. 5 say no. 5 say yes. He was among those 5 who said, yes, I'll come. And I'm like, dude, this is a very important, very known scholar.
That's a big pull.
He accepted to come on my podcast. I was like, wow, praise God.
Yeah.
So because he's not able to come on Sundays, we agreed for him to come this Friday, and I started reading the books. So we can expect that On Friday, on Sunday, Sean and I, my co-host, will
Good.
prepare something, probably something nerdy / fringy / supernatural. But yeah, that being said, please subscribe to Spencer's podcast. I included the links in this channel. May God bless you. I hope what we do encourages you, builds you up, teaches you, equips you, not just theologically, but also spiritually, emotionally, mentally, so that you'll be prepared better to live and defend your faith and to tell to others. That being said, may God bless you, Spencer. May God bless all of you being at the live chat or in the days to come. And we shall see you Friday. Have a good night.